New from ESCO Institute. This is what people are saying about the ESCO EPA Section 608 online interactive course.
Great presentation and understanding of materials. The clarity of topics are consistent, which helps the learning process immensely.
The flashcards, along with the excellent graphics and clear instructions, are fantastic.
I took the 608 core test before I came here and got 45%. After taking the ESCO course, I passed with 85%.
Do you need to get 608 certified? You will find the ESCO EPA Section 608 interactive course on the HVACR Learning Network. The HVACR industry's leading source of online and digital content. Visit us at hvacr.elearn.network.
All right, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us once again on Did You Know, the ESCO HVAC show. I told you that you needed to come find us on Tuesday because you were going to not miss us. And, well, this is what you found. Yeah, I know. It's one of those crazy things that I love to do when we're out and about. There was actually a whole crew of us all out in the gold, just having fun and learning about what's happening in our industry and transitions that we are all going through. We spent a lot of time with technologies, especially in the cold climate heat pump sector. We spent a bunch of time looking at refrigerants and what's happening in the refrigerant sector. And that's always a very, very hot item. So I'm actually joining this week from Champaign, Illinois, right here live from Hudson Technologies facility. And I'm joined by Kate Houghton. Kate's been on before. Kate, how you doing?
Fabulous, fabulous. Thanks for making the trek out here in the fog, and thank goodness it's a little bit warmer and it's not snow.
I know, it could have been pretty rough. So we're here to take a look at all the behind the scenes things that happen with refrigerants. Like what happens when a cylinder leaves the van and goes to the distributor. We never really see that path. So I've had the opportunity to get a closer glimpse at that. And we're going to do, here in the near future, we're going to do a road show and show you that journey. I'm going to paint a picture about that.
Absolutely. Can't wait. It does seem like this mythological what happens when the cylinder disappears from my van. But it's really, there's a lot of science, there's a lot of technology that goes through handling those refrigerants. But we're really excited to show everybody.
And here at Hudson, they process millions of pounds. I couldn't get over it. I was thinking, I asked the question, all right, are we talking hundreds of thousands? What are we talking in millions of pounds of refrigerants? So what we're going to talk about today is this transition that we have in refrigerants and how important it is to understand. Like we've been out here ringing this bell about what we're seeing in the industry, but I'm here to tell you there are things that are a little scary, actually, when we think about the transitions that we have going on. We always talk about the technology transition. We always talk about the transition with the HFC phase down, right? Mm-hmm. And there's still some confusion about that. And the thing that interests me the most is we actually have things going on at a more local level within the country that is going to change your perspective. So, Mr. Tebby, thank you for joining us down in Louisiana. We've got O'Neill Fuller out there. Everyone, let us know where you're joining in from. We love to see how large this community of HVAC, refrigeration, and building science professionals is growing. So, let's jump over, and we're going to start with where we are as a country.
Yep, at a federal level.
At the federal level, which I thought I had a pretty good understanding of. And then we're going to get into the local level, which I didn't even really, honestly, I didn't think about enough. And it blows my mind.
And it gets more involved every day.
It does. So everything we've been asking you to do so far with reclamation and recovery, you're going to need to do that about 5 times as much. All right. So let's hop over here and let's talk a little bit, Kate, about where we are, and that way we know where we're going.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you move to the slide and let's look at the step down. So it seems like we've been talking about the AIM Act for a bunch of years.
Yes.
But really, the AIM Act only came about in the last 2 or 3 years.
Yeah.
And we were talking about this 40% reduction against the baseline for a long time. Well, that's actually 24 days behind us.
That's so crazy to think about.
Isn't it?
We're here. It's not coming. It's absolutely here right now.
Absolutely here. So on January 1, we moved as an industry, the AIM Act, the allocation system, So there's a 40% reduction in place now compared to the baseline
Mm-hmm.
of HFC availability in the allowance system. And somehow we're here.
Yeah.
Somehow it happened.
I was really curious of that. I had an idea. You've all heard me trying to ring this bell about what would happen with our HFC refrigerants. I knew from our previous experience with HCFCs as well as CFCs, when our supply goes down, our price goes up. And we did see there's always this little weird drop. It happened with the HFC, particularly with R22, right before it began its big drop on the phase out. The price actually came down for a minute, but then really escalated. And so I had the opportunity to actually stop today and talk to one of my local distributors about what they are seeing for HFC prices. And they didn't want to be put on record, but they were saying that in December they've seen a 30% increase in prices for their HFC refrigerants, particularly R410a and R134a. That's kind of scary.
It is kind of scary, but I think, again, as an industry, started to see some price escalation, some concern about will we readily have the access to the product this year and in out years, and that tends to drive pricing a little bit too. And what you're also starting to see is folks think about refrigerants as it relates to the GWP.
Yes.
And as pricing, not just for, generally we might have thought HFCs as a big bundle, but now starting to see a little distinction between HFCs and pricing based on the GWP impact.
And so we have a lot of things driving that. One of the conversations I had at the counter at my distributor was, well, what happens when we potentially change our administration federally this year? Will it impact this? Will we go back to, this is all going away? And the answer was no. A lot of people forget about where we are. Remember, a lot of this actually started with the Kigali Amendment to the Montreal Protocol, right? That was brought in front of President Obama. It was brought in front of President Trump. And it actually wasn't even signed until we got over to the Biden administration. So along that way, we actually pretty much copied the entire phase down out of the Kigali Amendment. We put it into the AIM Act. It was signed. We give additional opportunity for the EPA to require training and certification for new refrigerants. And so we had a stamp from an act of Congress. We had a stamp from an international treaty. And so we began a slide that we're not going to get off from. We are going to continue this slide for the next decade. Maybe.
No, that's exactly the right way to look at it. And remember, when the AIM Act was passed, it was a bipartisan bill.
Yes, absolutely it was.
This is not something that can easily be undone.
Right.
So we're here and we're dealing with it.
We're here. So we talked about that 10% in 22. Now we have our additional 30% for 24. We have a 40% reduction in HFCs. So let's look at where that has taken us federally. And recap on some things that are changing the refrigerants that we are going to see in equipment, but it's also going to change the way we look at service gas, which really is kind of a shocker for me. And if anyone has any questions along the way, please let us know. Put them in the chat because we're here to clarify what's happening. Remember, the show is about bringing the top educators from the industry. I mean, how much better can it get than the VP of the company that it handles this entire reclamation process? So, all right, let's move forward a little bit and let's get it down into the nitty gritty.
Yeah, absolutely. So the AIM Act has 7, 8, 9 different components, and some of those components are actually still being legislated. So we're going to see it at the end of the summer this year. Really see the refrigerant management rule come out that we'll obviously talk about as we're going through here today. We've looked at the refrigerants there and the 40% on the refrigerant side. In the October timeframe last year, the EPA issued the final rule on what's known in the industry as technology transition.
Yes.
So addressing the Act addresses the refrigerants in one piece, and then it addresses the equipment and how those refrigerants are used. Right. And so there was a lot of kind of misunderstanding or poor wording a little bit.
I think so. Yeah, I think there was a lot of unclarified conversation in all of that.
Yeah, just way it was written and room for interpretation. And so the EPA actually moved and had a good cause rule that came out very rapidly after the final rule was issued. But what the technology transition rule does address is starting next year, So less than 12 months away.
Yeah.
In 11 months, because
Right.
goodness knows we're nearly at
We're
February
almost to
already.
February.
We're almost at February. How did that happen?
What happened?
I don't know. I don't know.
We're going to be saying this in 11 months. You realize that.
we're
Well, we
gonna-
told you all 11 months ago this is happening, and you waited, and now you're there.
Absolutely. So 11 months from now, the technology transition rule requires that OEMs will no longer be able to make HVAC AC equipment
Yeah.
that contains 410A.
Yeah, that's huge. You know,
Absolutely.
we set these numbers, we talk about the GWPs of refrigerants, and we go, okay, I may or may not be comfortable with these GWPs, but when we actually put a stamp on it and says, okay, this is the refrigerants that are included or excluded from this, we go, all right, this is the things that I see, and right at the top of the list, we go, R410a? Like, not at all even available in new residential air conditioning and heat pump equipment?
Yeah. Yeah, that's absolutely. So the equipment using 410A needs to be manufactured in very simple terms. We could talk all day just about technology transition.
Yes.
But in very simple terms, needs to be manufactured by December 31st this year. There was a good cause amendment that allows the sell-through of that for a little bit
For
longer.
additional 12 months. We've seen that come through.
Yeah.
At the end, like right
right at the last minute of last year. But the equipment can't be made of January 1 of 2025. So any new equipment that starts to be made next year has to have a GWP of less than 700, and we have to be into new refrigerants at that point as an industry.
I spent a lot of time here at the AHR Expo talking to our manufacturers. A lot of videos. I put out a couple of them already. I'll have a bunch over the next couple of weeks or few weeks talking about the equipment, and that's really what it comes down to. Everyone is utilizing low GWP equipment, some of that being released very quickly. A lot of people don't realize that we already have furnaces that have hit the market that are equipped with the controls to be able to accept our new RDS sensors, refrigerant detection sensors. I had a technical support friend of mine call just last week and said, hey, I got a furnace that is got an error code that it is not finding the refrigerant detection sensor. And I went, oh, that's interesting. So looking in the manuals, we see that our equipment was already prepared for it. So we haven't seen the outdoor units in many of the residential, but the manufacturer's saying, yeah, you're going to see those by third quarter. So not very long.
No, not far away at all.
Not exactly. So that's primarily where we're starting. So we're talking about residential. We're talking about the technology transition rule stating that there will be no more R410A in residential products by then. That's clear. But there's a lot of other things going on that I wasn't even particularly aware of. It's like I'd heard about, but I wasn't clear on what that is.
Absolutely. And this is all at the federal level.
Yes.
This is all at the
Let's
EPA
start big.
federal level.
Here's the minimum.
The minimum requirements, the quote-unquote standard around the country.
Yeah.
Until you start to get into state-based regulation.
Yeah, because we see that, like, say you take safety, right? Let's take OSHA standards. We may be able to have a standard that is recognized for the entire country federally, but we may have local codes that's more stringent than that. So I hadn't thought about that perspective until you and I sat down and had this conversation, and I went, oh, wow, I missed the bar completely. So that 11 month from now has a lot of things that, yeah. And we won't even go into the rest of them, the chillers and the ice rinks and data centers. So, we always talk about how this is our industry that's making a change. Well, there are a lot of different industries that are going through this. So when you look down through there, there's a lot of people getting impacted in equipment the way that we are. So it's not just us.
Absolutely. It's very, very far-ranging. Yep.
So here's what, from the federal level, here's really what we're looking at in the amount of refrigerant that is available versus what could be available versus what we need. So can we break this down just a little bit and talk about from a federal side?
Absolutely. So the EPA on an annual basis for many, many years has published the consolidated data about refrigerant reclamation. So all EPA certified reclaimers, just as Hudson and all of our industry, has to report to EPA some very prescriptive reporting and buckets in terms of how you look at refrigerants. And so it's been going on for a number of years. In December, late December actually, the EPA issued the 2022 numbers. So seeing on an overall basis an increase in reclamation, but possibly not in the right buckets and not in the right areas.
Oh, okay.
So as you start to think about that, and then the EPA, as part of the refrigerant management rule, has looked at as you look forward to 2028, 2029, how much reclaimed refrigerant
It's actually
is
coming back.
needed
Yeah.
to be able to meet mandates and to be able to meet proposed regulation. We're looking at needing about a 5-fold increase in reclamation to be able to cover that gap between now and when we get to 2028, 2029.
Versus what we've seen in 2022.
Versus what we've seen in 2022. So if you look at
That's a lot of
HFCs
refrigerant.
in general, we need to grow that to something in the order of a 5-fold increase to be able to meet the predicted requirements from a federal level in 2028, 2029.
So I get the question all the time of, hey, I recover refrigerant and I bring refrigerant back. Does not everyone do that? And
Not everybody does.
yeah.
Yeah, not everybody does. And if you look at where we're at on HFCs compared to the peak of R22, again, the story is very similar. We're far below that peak of recovered HFCs that we saw in that 2014, 2015 peak of recovery on
Yeah.
22.
Remember that.
You think about when HFC systems 410A started to really be installed in
Yeah.
the 2010 kind of era, we should be at that initial flush of end of life. So those units are coming offline, those units are needing to be replaced,
Yeah.
and we're not seeing the commensurate growth in the recovery and reclamation of HFCs yet.
Okay, so as much as we ring the bell, as much as we say we have to, you need it, the industry has to have it, we're struggling to get to that,
We are.
let alone 5 times that.
We are.
Okay. All right. So we know that that's where we start. We know that is the federal expectation. What we started talking about earlier was it does get more stringent than that. And
does.
it's in the effort to make sure that we have enough service gas. Remember, when we talk about our industry, we need refrigerant primarily in 2 places, newly manufactured and service gas.
Exactly. And you think about, so this year, we will continue to install HFC systems.
Oh, yeah.
The sell-through period, again,
It's
it's been
another
extended
year.
by a year. So you will install or have the ability, as an industry, will have the ability to install a HFC system through to the end of 2025.
Right.
Somebody buys that system as a brand new system, they expect to be able to get the useful life out of that equipment. Again, a 10 or 15-year time period.
Yeah, whatever that looks like.
Which means that servicing refrigerant
Has to be around.
has to be around and becomes really critical just on that basis, let alone any other mandate for prescriptions on where recovered and reclaimed refrigerant has to be used as well.
Okay, so the technology transition gives us a template, gives us a path to stop using R410a in new equipment, go to lower GWP refrigerants so that we do have some of that R410a service gas available, but then it gets tricky
Yes.
when we go beyond what is expected at the federal level and we start looking at the state level.
Exactly. And it becomes really complicated really quickly.
I had no idea.
Yeah. So there's, as we've seen, so that there's lots. We could talk for 4 days
Yeah.
just about state level. So there's lots of action that's happening at a state level that is moving faster. And when I say moving faster, regulation is coming into play faster than the federal level regulation is happening.
From the technology transition rule, faster than that.
Exactly. So take a couple of small examples. In New York State, you cannot, as of this year, install a 134a chiller.
What?
Because the GWP limits and the application and the technology transition rule equivalent in New York State is already in front of the technology transition rule at the federal level in the AIM Act. So you can't install a 134a chiller in New York State already this year.
All right, that completely changes the way I think about the technology transition rule. Because the technology transition rule already is getting a lot of questions from technicians. They're going, is it really coming this fast? And we're going, yes. Yes, it is coming this fast. You will not be installing R410A systems in residential after next year. And they're going, oh, okay, well, that's next year. Then we'll see chillers and we'll see all this other stuff after that. And that's not the case.
That's not the case. And as you can see here in the green, if you look at this chart, the green states are really taking a version of the AIM Act with more stringent requirements and moving faster in terms of implementing those with or existing and proposed regulation.
Okay, so all the dark green states, California,
Virginia,
Washington, New York.
Yep. So you start to get, as you look at equipment, as you look at regulation, you now become, where am I operating? What equipment am I handling? In what state is it going? What's my access to refrigerant? What refrigerant am I allowed to buy? What's my recovered refrigerant needs? What's the regulation for using reclaimed refrigerant? And all of those things are now not mandated uniformly under a federal level, that you start to really have to get into the differences in every single state and knowing your local.
Oh my goodness. We always talk about the need for a unified HVAC contractor license for the United States because we don't have anything like that. So, and we don't even have every state utilizing an HVAC contractor license. So I was really anticipating that the technology transition rule would be this mass adopted, uniform roadmap that we would follow as an industry, but because we have so many states that are pushing for decarbonization faster than that, they have implemented their own more stringent policies.
Yeah.
That's a lot to absorb.
It really is a lot to absorb. And it really, again, you have to be looking at operating in each individual state as almost entirely separate, in some cases, as the federal regulation. That the state will preempt, the state regulations are preempting and moving faster than EPA and federal regulation.
So, do we have an idea of where we're going with this, who's doing what, and what we can expect? I mean, that's a lot. Can we pick on anyone to start with?
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about California.
Okay, only one, right? Everyone says, it always starts in California, and then it goes to the rest of the world. No. It looks like we already have, at least 3 states that are following a similar design of what they're more than the technology transition rule states kind of construction. So we're going to use California because it's very clear, and it paints a picture of where we're probably going to go.
Where a number of the other states are looking towards California and moving in those directions. Exactly. And again, California would be moving faster in terms of the application of some of these regulations than even the AIM Act.
Okay.
So if you go backwards in time, 2 or 3 years, California was looking to accelerate the move to lower GWP.
Yeah, I've heard that a lot. Yeah, they were trying to push for 500 years ago. Yeah,
absolutely.
Okay.
And where they started to run into trouble was the clash between the regulations allowing A2Ls and those lower, and the installation of that equipment versus their requirement to get to the GWP limit.
Indeed.
So it's partnership with industry, equipment manufacturers, reclaimers, building codes. California, the first thing that they worked on was this regulation that required OEMs to use 10%, the equivalent of 10% of their factory charge as reclaimed refrigerant. So taking that reclaimed refrigerant, and the OEMs could do one of 2 things. They could put that reclaimed refrigerant in equipment, and we saw industry scene OEMs do that.
Okay.
Or alternatively, use the reclaimed refrigerant in the aftermarket servicing of equipment, so that the reclaimed refrigerant again was going into use in the servicing aspect of equipment.
But it would almost only be available to service companies associated with that manufacturer, though, wouldn't it? Because it'd be hard to put that back into the supply for all of the service gases.
So you have to. The OEMs, the requirements for the OEMs to demonstrate
to utilize that
they have that in the aftermarket servicing.
Okay, yeah.
So OEMs have gone a couple of different ways. Some of them have distributed it through their own service arms.
Exactly.
Some of them through their authorized dealers and their authorized representatives, things like that. Again, some of them have actually put it in equipment, certified reclaimed refrigerant in their actual equipment at the factory, at the first fill.
One thing that I learned while I was here it was kind of a shocker to me. It was something that I assumed was happening, but I what happens when you assume. A lot of things can happen. I always assumed that the refrigerant that was going into new equipment was already AHRI 700 standard, not recognizing that not necessarily. Hopefully, but not necessarily. But when we take that refrigerant, when that is a used refrigerant, it's came out of a system and it's came back to, say, Hudson for reclamation, it can actually come back as a service gas that is purer than the original gas that it started with.
Yeah, so it's a little known fact. When refrigerant is virgin manufactured, it's not required to be certified to AHRI 700. It's presumed that it's manufactured
to that standard. Yes.
To that standard, but does not require the certification, the lab testing, and the certification. Reclaimed refrigerant can only be called reclaimed refrigerant when it's certified to
meet that
AHRI 700.
Yeah.
And it has to meet or exceed
true.
AHRI 700. So as reclaimers are processing that, like ourselves here at Hudson, often that reclaimed refrigerant is certified to greater standards and exceeds AHRI 700 with the documentation that goes along with that. So it's
pretty intriguing.
It's not commonly known, but is a fact in our industry.
I had the opportunity to go around with Kate to actually learn about the facility and what happens, and I was so intrigued. I can't wait for us to do a road show so that you can see that entire process, because you'll look at it going, wow, this is like a mad scientist experiment going on, and what comes out is this beautiful, certified, potentially better than original refrigerant. So knowing that we have the ability to take a used refrigerant, a refrigerant out of a system, and turn it into a very, very pure refrigerant, makes sense why we would want to make sure that we have some of our service gas going back in. The more service gas we get, the more supply we have, because that HFC phase down is on newly produced refrigerant.
Correct.
Doesn't really apply to the recertified refrigerant that is coming from reclamation.
Not at all. So there's no allocation system on recovered and reclaimed refrigerant.
Yeah.
And in fact, the EPA, as part of the AIM Act, is required to create and promulgate regulation to grow reclamation.
Oh, okay, that makes sense.
That is part of that whole AIM Act as well.
So it's more than just us out here ringing the bell. There's actually requirements for this to happen.
There is.
Oh, I love
There
that.
is.
We're going to be hanging out with the EPA at the National HVACR Education Conference. We look forward to having you all there. Kate, you're going to be hanging out with us. We're going to be doing classes. We're going to be learning about this entire process. So we want to make sure that you come join us. And if you have questions about this, you can come talk to the reclamation facilities themselves, the people who run the facilities that know these standards. We can talk to the EPA. We can talk to people from the industry that can keep you up to date, just like we're doing here.
Absolutely.
Right?
Fabulous conference. Wouldn't miss it.
Oh, I like that little segue in there.
Absolutely.
Just a little
Love it.
tag.
Absolutely. Would not miss it. Would not miss it.
Okay, so this chart in particular, I'm going to bring us to the side so that we can see the entire conversation, because this is kind of shocking to think about something that is more stringent than the technology transition rule.
Absolutely. So in California, the first piece of this regulation that we're talking about was the requirement for reclaimed refrigerant for OEMs. The regulation also addressed the technology transition for California. And so effective this year, again, chillers cannot be sold into California with a refrigerant that has a GWP of greater than 750. That's faster than the technology transition rule at the AIM Act EPA federal level.
Yeah, absolutely it is.
So you're starting to see a mismatch, if you will, in terms of timing. And this is already moving into effect and is in effect 12 months before our federal regulation.
What was already in place with the technology transition rule. So what is that going to look like for refrigerants going into California for the next year or so?
So the next thing that California did is they passed SB 1206.
Okay, and we may come back to this other one on chillers, but this is a pretty significant thing that has happened.
Absolutely. So again, coming up for, I guess, close to 18 months ago now, SB 1206 was passed. And that this rule, this California rule, addresses refrigerant directly again, and the application relating to GWP. And What really is interesting is just as the beginning phase is it defines bulk refrigerant. And so here at Hudson, we think about bulk refrigerant as ISO containers of 30,000 pounds at a time.
Large containers. So would
Large
I.
containers.
Yeah, at least 125-pound cylinders. Those I would consider those probably being bulk, but
California considers essentially any packaging of refrigerant to be bulk. So a 24-pound, 25-pound, 30-pound disposable cylinder is covered under this regulation because under the California definition, that's bulk refrigerant.
so a standard box of refrigerant right from the parts counter.
From your parts wholesale supply is covered under this regulation.
Okay. So California is going to implement GWP limits on the refrigerants that we buy on a daily basis that far exceeds the technology transition rule.
Yes. So the first date here for SB 1206 is January 1, 2025. Again,
11 months.
Amazingly, less than a year away,
Yeah.
11 months away. You will not be able to buy, and I'll use the word packaged, instead of bulk, but you will not be able to buy packaged refrigerant that has a GWP of greater than 2,200.
Okay.
So that's, put it in real terms, 404A, 507, you will not be able to buy virgin 404A and 507 in the state of California. A wholesale parts and supply house can't buy it. A contractor can't
That's
buy
crazy.
it. An end user can't buy it.
So if I have an existing, so 404 is a primary low temp refrigerant, right? So many of our walk-in freezers are R404. So we have a lot of 404 racks out there. Most of my low temp grocery store refrigeration was R404. So that means after January 1st of 2025, I will not be able to go buy 404?
Buy virgin 404.
Yeah.
You can buy reclaimed 404 for servicing of those systems. And there's
Okay.
requirements to start using reclaimed for the servicing of those systems. But virgin 404, no, you won't be able to walk into a wholesaler and buy that.
Because of its highest global
Because
warming
of the
potential.
GWP, it exceeds that first limit of 2,200. And
And that makes sense because internationally, 404 was one of the first refrigerants to be taken off from the use list.
Mm-hmm.
We're actually just catching up to a lot of countries when it comes to the refrigerant transition. So what California and other states are starting to do is say, I see this, I know that we're going to put the technology transition rule into place, but because of the HFC phase down, we're going to escalate this so that after January 1st of 2025, you cannot buy virgin refrigerant in the state of California.
Mm-hmm.
You're going to have to buy reclaimed refrigerant that has been reprocessed to HRI 700 standard so that we can use our service gas to go back into service,
to go back into service.
to work on service equipment, because we're already no longer going to have our 404 systems going in because of the technology transition rule. And now California's saying, oh, and by the way, you're not even going to service the existing systems with new refrigerant. You're going to use reclaimed refrigerant that's been recertified, so you must recover 404 and put recertified refrigerant back into the system because you're not going to be able to go out and buy anything else.
You got it. It really becomes this circularity, and the only way to keep that system running is going to be 404. What's interesting, if we pick on 404, is that's in a refrigerant in commercial refrigeration that's frequently, because it's staying with that system owner, is frequently not reclaimed but is reused by owners.
Yeah.
And so the supply of reclaimed refrigerant.
It's going to stay in those facilities.
But the supply, if you have a loss and you're looking for it, it's not going to be that easy to come by.
Oh my
There's
goodness.
some real dynamics with 404 that make it particularly interesting to see how this plays out. And again, just picking on 404A a little bit.
Yeah.
But the demand for reclaimed 404 is going to grow. Again, comes back to how do we make sure as we're doing conversions, as we're looking at that we're recovering as an industry, as everybody in that supply chain, from the contractor, the end user, the equipment folks, the reclaimers, we have to be making sure every pound of all of those refrigerants are coming back, because these mandates and requirements for the use of reclaim are going to start competing with each other.
Absolutely. I sit and I think about the states that are not going to be pursuing that, escalated projection of use, going, oh, well, we'll just take ours in and we'll put our service gas back into the into the network because it's going to have some value to it now because other states need it. Well, what happens with my own state? We're just going to escalate the problem if we're not recovering as much as we possibly can. So all of you commercial refrigeration folks out there, I hope you heard that, especially those that are in California. So it's going to get crazy for you in less than a year. So make sure that we're preparing for that and we understand it. I don't want you to get to January 1st of 2025 and go, why can't I go out and buy a jug of 404 anymore? And you go, well, you can, but you're not buying virgin refrigerant 404. You're now going to be into those surplus gases, those gases that we have not focused on before as being super important, which we were always supposed to. Shame on you if you weren't. Shame on all of us because we all grew up in a time where it wasn't focused on. Now it absolutely is. And it goes further than that. So when we think about the other refrigerants as well, we have all of the other refrigerants, at least in a few of these states, that are going to be escalating that curve faster than the technology transition rule again. So we know that our HFCs were on that phase down, so 85% reduction by 2036. We had different types of equipment being phased down depending on what it was, whether it was a system, whether it was a component, has different dates for that. But now we can look at, let's take, for instance, January of 2030, right? I know that's a few years off. We're talking just under 6 years away. But in reality, in just under 6 years, R410a is going to be prohibited as new refrigerants in the states as well, at least in California.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So,
but there will remain an installed base of equipment
still needs gas.
that still needs
if there's
gas.
problems. Yeah.
And a very large base of installed equipment.
Yeah. So now we really go back to looking at leak rates and understanding that every leak is a loss of service gas.
Exactly. That's exactly the way to look at it. So
Yeah.
every time we have a leak that goes unrepaired, that we don't do something about, it prevents the recovery of that refrigerant at some future point in time. And that leaking gas never comes back,
Right.
never goes back into the system as service gas.
And the price just continues to escalate faster than we're already being introduced to. We've typically not thought of it from that perspective, but I think I have to. I have to start looking at refrigerant as an investment in the future of my company. If I do not fix that leak, for every amount that is lost, we're going to have to come up with that somewhere else.
That's right.
And it could potentially be a lot more expensive because I allowed it to escape. Oh, wow.
Yeah, we talk a lot here at Hudson about it starts nothing in this whole supply chain, as you look a couple of years out, nothing happens unless that first pound is recovered. And if that pound can't be recovered or isn't recovered, then none of what we're talking about here today, Clifton, actually can happen at all. So if we're not fixing leaks, if we're not repairing systems, maintaining systems, then we're not recovering that refrigerant. None of this can be supported. And it's really that important. It's really that important.
It really falls in our lap to be able to keep this even remotely on track.
Absolutely. And to your point about the economics, again, somebody in that contracting world, in that wholesaler world, the value and the economics, really thinking about this recovered refrigerant as an asset.
Yeah, 100%.
It is not a liability. It is not something that's just too difficult to deal with. As you start to look at how this is playing out, the economics have rapidly changed for recovered refrigerant on an industry level, not just, again, here at Hudson.
Yeah.
It's rapidly changed. It's going to continue to change. And so contractors become part of their own supply chain, and they become part of funding their own supply chain. It's a really different way to think about it, but it might move the needle for us all as well.
I think it is the way we are going to have to look at it. And we have to change our mentality just a little bit and look at the bigger, broader perspective. What am I doing today that's going to make a difference for tomorrow and next month and next year and a few years down the road? How can I stay in business with the equipment that I am installing and servicing? All right.
Exactly.
I know there are some brains out there that are just rattling right now. So if you have any questions or positive comments, remember, we won't allow any negative comments here because we're here to work through these difficult times. All of us have negative comments that we can share, but we need to share the positive comments so that we can get better and we can understand this transition, because we're professionals that need to be the leaders in our industry, because there's going to be a lot of people caught with their shorts down in this. There's going to be a lot of people going out to buy a jug of refrigerant going, what do you mean it's went up this much? And they say, well, how much are you bringing back? I could see, if I was a distributor, I could absolutely see myself going, you know what? If you're buying my refrigerant and you're not bringing any back, you may not be on my list of selling to in the future, because you're affecting my supply of refrigerant to all of my customers. Wow.
It's really something to think about. It really is something to think about. And we've heard in the market that conversation is starting to happen at a wholesale supply house.
Why not? I mean, if I think about that, how can I as a distributor sell equipment to a contractor knowing that they're not recovering gas properly, they're allowing leaks to happen, and they're just going to keep coming back buying service gas that my contractors that are doing the right thing are not going to have access to?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I ain't even going to go there. I know I'm going to have some distributors calling me on that one going, wait, we got to talk about this a little bit more. But it's the reality of where we are.
It is the reality of where we are. But this all allows for collaboration. I mean, we're, as an industry, again, we're all in this together.
Yeah.
Right?
Look at that. There's a manufacturer right there, or distributor right there saying, hey, that's kind of how we're looking at that, is we're looking at our contractors going, you know, our better contractors are the ones that are doing things right and should be rewarded for doing things right. So by doing things right, we're going to help them be more successful. And the ones that are doing things wrong, they may fall to the wayside.
Right. Right.
Thanks, Dan. Boy, we appreciate that one. Yeah. So you can all see that there's a lot happening.
Yes. Yeah, there really is. We live in interesting times.
We do, and there's been times where we struggle getting through transitions. I mean, we think back about transitions. Okay, here's a question for everyone. Let's throw a little trivia in. How many refrigerant transitions have we seen in the last 100 years? Let's ponder on that for a while. Think about that and put it in the chat, and we'll see if everyone has an idea on that. We'll come back to that one. All right, so we see that California is really being aggressive. We see that Washington is being aggressive. We see that New York is being aggressive. We see that many other states are starting to become more aggressive, and these are the ways we learn about it.
Absolutely, absolutely. And it's increasing the pressure on technology, on moving, on understanding regulation, and on demand driving specifically for you have to have reclaimed refrigerant for applications.
Indeed.
And which, again, means at the end of the day, as an industry, we have to continue to grow reclamation, because there are more and more requirements outside of end users and customers wanting reclaimed refrigerant for its own environmental benefits.
Yeah.
And the carbon reduction that comes with that, and the impact that it can have for an ESG score for end users. That aside, which is growing and starting to become its own demand, these requirements and regulations and stipulations right now are looking like they will exceed the supply. And that's a problem.
That is absolutely a problem. And it's a problem that we can combat together in partnerships. Dan, I really appreciate that again. It is very much about partnerships. You know, we talk about this community of HVAC and refrigeration and building sciences. We're a big village.
Yep.
And as long as we are all working together and having the partnerships, we will all get through it. But we all have to do our part, whether we are the technician on the ground, whether we are the distributor, the manufacturer, whether we're in reclamation, whether we're a trades association, whether we're a lawmaker, whether we're an environmental protection agency that's overseeing many of it, that's being controlled by acts of Congress and international treaties. We all have our part to do with this. So let's talk about a good refrigerant management plan. Let's look at some primary ways of this life cycle of refrigerant and how it can work.
Yeah, absolutely. And so there's a paper that references here, and encourage anybody to go out and to read this. And this was an industry collaboration from a couple of the NGOs, EIA, NRDC, Hudson was a contributor. There was a couple other industry stakeholders that were contributors as well. So
Okay.
it's really a paper that looks at how do we increase life cycle refrigerant management? How do we get all of those stakeholders, everybody who's a party to, again,
Work
from
together.
the contractor, the distributor, the equipment, the end users, to think about refrigerant and its life cycle differently.
Okay.
And really maximize that recovery, maximize the reuse, minimize leaks. So again, as we talked about a little earlier, every pound that leaks is a pound that can't be put back into service at some future point in time. Wow. Thinking about training as a part of, are we